Nathaniel Whitmore stepped out of his sleek black Aston Martin, the hum of the powerful engine fading into the crisp New York air. The afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows between the towering tombstones of Greenwood Cemetery. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored charcoal suit, a practiced movement, one that usually grounded him. But today, no amount of control or precision could dull the sharp edges of grief clawing at his chest. It had been 5 years since Claire died. 5 years since the only woman who had ever seen him beyond the boardroom, beyond the Billionaire, had slipped away. Nate exhaled slowly, the autumn breeze rustling the golden leaves at his feet as he walked the familiar path to her grave. In the world he had built, one of high-stakes acquisitions, power plays, and unimaginable wealth, there was no room for sentiment. And yet, once a year, he allowed himself this moment. A pilgrimage of sorts, a ritual that both comforted and tortured him. As he approached the headstone, he noticed something that didn't belong in his controlled world. A small figure sat curled at the base of Claire's grave, shivering beneath a thin, tattered hoodie. Nate froze. A child. He was too old for a toddler, too young to be here alone. Maybe 6 or 7. His thin arms were wrapped around his knees, his face pale beneath the dark curls that peeked from under the hood. The boy wasn't crying, but there was a quiet devastation in the way he held himself, in the way his small fingers traced the letters of Claire's name on the stone. Nate's pulse pounded, a strange, disorienting sense of familiarity settling in his gut. Who was this kid? And why did he feel as if he belonged here? Clearing his throat, Nate took a step closer, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice carrying both authority and curiosity. "Are you lost?" The boy looked up slowly, his large blue eyes locking onto Nate's with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. There was something eerily familiar in that gaze, something that made Nate's breath hitch. The boy shook his head. "No." "Then what are you doing here?" Nate asked, his gaze narrowing. The child hesitated before answering, his voice barely above a whisper. "I came to see my mom." Nate's stomach dropped. For a moment he thought he had misheard, but the boy's eyes didn't waver. His small hand lifted, pointing to the name engraved on the headstone. Claire Whitmore. The world tilted beneath Nate's feet. His mind scrambled for logic, for reason. Claire never had a child. He would have known. Wouldn't he? A sudden cold settled deep in his bones. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice lower now, controlled but unsteady. The boy sniffled, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "She was my mom," he repeated. "She used to visit me before she went away." Nate's heart slammed against his ribs. Number impossible. Claire had been his wife, his partner. They had talked about children, dreamed about it, but their careers, their ambitions, had always gotten in the way. And then, she was gone. His hands clenched into fists, his mind racing, trying to grasp the impossibility of the moment. If what this boy was saying was true, Claire had kept a secret, a life-altering secret from him. And now, the proof of that secret sat in front of him, staring at him with her eyes. Swallowing hard, Nate forced himself to stay calm. "What's your name, kid?" The boy hesitated. "Danny." Danny. The name meant nothing to him. Yet, as he studied the child's face, the delicate features, the familiar tilt of his head, something inside him cracked. His voice was quieter now. "Where do you live?" Danny looked away, his small fingers trailing over the cold stone. "At the shelter, in Brooklyn." Shelter. The word landed like a punch to the gut. A child, Claire's child, living in a shelter while he sat in a penthouse worth more than most people made in a lifetime? The thought made his stomach churn. How had this happened? Where was his father? How had Claire managed to keep this from him? Who told you Claire was your mother? Danny's fingers curled into his hoodie. Miss Joan. She said my mommy left me there when I was a baby, that she loved me but couldn't keep me. She used to visit, but then she stopped coming. Miss Joan said she went to heaven. His small voice trembled on the last word, and something inside Nate cracked wide open. Claire had visited this boy. The woman he had shared a life with, who had sworn there were no secrets between them, had been living a lie. She had a son. She had been a mother, and she had never told him. Nate rubbed a hand over his face, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was a man who thrived on control, on knowing every variable before making a move. But this was chaos. This was personal in a way that nothing had ever been before. He inhaled deeply, looking at the boy again. Danny, Claire's son, maybe his son. A part of him wanted to walk away, to let the past remain buried. But another part, the part that had never stopped loving Claire, knew he couldn't. He crouched down, leveling his gaze with Danny's. Come with me. Danny blinked up at him, hesitant. Where? Somewhere warm. Nate extended his hand. You shouldn't be out here in the cold. Danny looked at the grave one last time before, slowly, cautiously, slipping his small hand into Nate's. As their fingers met, something shifted. A crack in the carefully constructed walls Nate had spent years building around himself. This wasn't a business deal. This wasn't a merger or a negotiation. This was Claire, and somehow in the middle of it all was a little boy who had no idea how much he had just changed everything. For the first time in years, Nathaniel Whitmore didn't know what came next. Nathaniel Whitmore gripped the steering wheel of his Aston Martin as he navigated through the dimly lit streets of New York. The silence in the car was thick, punctuated only by the rhythmic hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of fabric as the small boy beside him shifted uncomfortably. Danny, Claire's son. A child who wasn't supposed to exist. Nate stole a glance at him. The boy sat curled in the passenger seat, his fingers gripping the sleeves of his worn-out hoodie. He was small, too small for his age, and the way he held himself, shoulders drawn in, head slightly lowered, spoke of a child who had learned too early that the world was not always kind. Claire had been many things, brilliant, driven, kind, but she had never been a mother. At least, that's what he had believed. And yet the proof of her secret sat right beside him, his face carrying echoes of hers. Nate exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. He was a man of logic, of certainty. He built his empire on facts, numbers, and calculated risks. But there was nothing logical about this. Nothing made sense. Where are we going? Danny's voice was small, uncertain. Nate tightened his grip on the wheel. Somewhere warm, he answered. You don't belong out on the streets. Danny hesitated before nodding, his little fingers tracing the seam of his jeans. Do you have any other family? Nate asked, forcing himself to keep his voice even. Danny shook his head. Number just Miss Joan and the other kids at the shelter. The shelter. Claire's child had been growing up in a shelter while he sat in a penthouse worth millions. The realization made Nate's stomach churn. How had this happened? Why had she hidden this from him? Had she been afraid to tell him? Had she thought he wouldn't accept her son? His jaw clenched. Number Claire had known him. She had known the kind of man he was. If she had kept this a secret, there had to be a reason. We'll figure this out, he murmured, more to himself than to Danny. A few minutes later, Nate pulled into the underground garage of his building. As the engine shut off, Danny hesitated, looking around with wide, uncertain eyes. You live here? He asked softly. Nate nodded. Yeah. Danny stared at the sleek walls, the expensive cars parked in designated spots. It's big. Nate let out a short breath. Yeah. He got out of the car, rounding it to open the door for Danny, who climbed out hesitantly, still clutching his sleeves. Nate led him to the private elevator, pressing the button for the penthouse. The ride was silent, the numbers ticking higher as Danny stared at his reflection in the mirrored walls. His blue eyes, Claire's eyes, held a storm of emotions too heavy for a child his age. When the doors slid open, they stepped into the expansive penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, the glass reflecting the twinkling lights of Manhattan. The open concept space was sleek, modern, and cold. There was no warmth, no sign of life, just expensive furniture, a pristine kitchen that had rarely been used, and the faint scent of leather and polished wood. Danny's small sneakers barely made a sound as he stepped inside. He turned slowly, taking it all in before shifting awkwardly. "You hungry?" Nate asked, already moving toward the kitchen. Danny nodded hesitantly. "A little." Nate scanned the contents of his fridge and sighed. He wasn't exactly equipped for feeding a child. His lifestyle revolved around business meetings, late-night dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, and meal plans prepared by a private chef he rarely used. After a moment of deliberation, he pulled out bread and cheese. "Grilled cheese, okay?" Danny's lips twitched slightly, the closest thing to a smile Nate had seen. "Yeah." That was something, at least. Nate worked in silence, buttering the bread, heating the pan. He wasn't used to this, domestic tasks, small talk, caring for anyone but himself. But as he flipped the sandwich and heard the satisfying sizzle, he realized something unsettling. This felt oddly grounding. A few minutes later, he placed the plate in front of Danny, who picked up the sandwich and took a cautious bite. His eyes widened slightly, and for the first time since they had met, his shoulders relaxed just a fraction. "This is really good," he said softly. Nate found himself chuckling. "It's just grilled cheese, kid." Danny looked up at him then, and there was something in his gaze, something that hit Nate in a way he hadn't expected. A quiet sort of gratitude, like he wasn't used to someone doing something for him without expecting anything in return. Nate cleared his throat. "You can sleep here tonight. There's a guest room down the hall." Danny hesitated, setting his sandwich down. "Are you going to take me back tomorrow?" The question caught Nate off guard. He should say yes. That would be the logical thing to do. He had no business taking in a child, especially one that came with a past he didn't understand. But as he looked at the boy sitting at his kitchen counter, wearing a hoodie 2 sizes too big and eating a simple meal like it was the best thing he'd had in days, he couldn't bring himself to say it. "We'll figure it out," he said instead. Danny studied him, then nodded. He seemed to accept that answer, even if Nate wasn't sure he did. Later that night, after Danny had settled into the guest room, Nate stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The city stretched out beneath him, endless, untouchable. For years, this had been enough. His empire, his wealth, his control over everything and everyone in his world. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, it felt empty. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he hadn't dialed in years. After a few rings, a gruff voice answered. "Whitmore? I need you to look into something for me," Nate said, his voice low and controlled. "A kid named Danny, 6 years old, lived in a shelter in Brooklyn." There was a pause. "Why?" Nate's gaze drifted down the hall, where behind the closed door a small boy lay asleep in a bed that wasn't his. "Because I think he's my son." The words felt foreign in his mouth, but once spoken, there was no taking them back. Silence stretched on the other end of the line before the investigator finally spoke. "I'll get you answers." Nate ended the call, exhaling slowly. Answers. That's what he needed. Proof. Clarity. But deep down, he already knew. Danny wasn't just Claire's secret. He was Nate's too. Nathaniel Whitmore was a man who thrived on certainty. He built his empire on facts, strategy, and calculated risks. But as he stood outside the guest room door, listening to the steady breathing of the boy sleeping inside, he realized he had walked into something he couldn't quantify. Danny, Claire's son. His son. The thought had haunted him all night, keeping him from sleep. He had spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation he'd ever had with Claire, searching for a moment, a hint, anything that would have told him she had been hiding a child. But there was nothing. Not once had she mentioned pregnancy, an adoption, or a past life that included a little boy. And yet, Danny existed. Nate's grip tightened on the whiskey glass in his hand. The weight of this revelation settled heavily in his chest. He had called in the best private investigator he knew, but even before the results came back, he already felt the truth in his bones. Danny was connected to Claire, and by extension, he was connected to Nate. With a slow exhale, he left his spot by the door and walked back into the living room. The penthouse was still, the only sounds coming from the faint hum of the city beyond the massive glass windows. He had built this life for himself, an empire of power and solitude. It was efficient, controlled. He had never wanted for anything. So why did it suddenly feel hollow? The next morning, Nate brewed his coffee in silence, his mind racing. He wasn't used to sharing his space, let alone with a child. The guest room had remained closed for years, untouched and unused. Now it held something that made the entire penthouse feel different. Less like a fortress, more like a home. A light shuffling behind him broke his thoughts. He turned to see Danny standing in the doorway, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. His too big hoodie sagged around his small frame, his hair sticking up in every direction. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Nate cleared his throat. "Did you sleep okay?" Danny nodded but didn't move further inside. "Yeah." "You hungry?" Another nod. Nate set his coffee down. "Come on, let's see what we can find." Danny hesitated before padding forward, his small footsteps barely making a sound against the polished floors. He climbed onto a stool at the kitchen island while Nate opened the fridge, staring at its contents with a slight frown. Right. He wasn't exactly stocked for kids. "Eggs okay?" Nate asked. Danny shrugged. "I like pancakes." Nate sighed, searching the cabinets. Of course, he didn't have pancake mix. He barely had groceries that weren't catered meals. "I'll have someone bring some over later," he said. "For now, eggs." Danny didn't protest, though he looked less than thrilled. As Nate cracked eggs into a pan, Danny fidgeted, his fingers tapping against the countertop. "Do you do this a lot?" the boy asked suddenly. Nate glanced over. "Cook?" Danny nodded. "Not really," Nate admitted. "Usually my assistant handles things like this." Danny tilted his head. "Why?" "Because I've never had to take care of anyone. Because I've never let anyone close enough." Instead, Nate just said, "Because I work a lot." Danny accepted the answer, watching as Nate plated the eggs. When Nate placed the plate in front of him, the boy dug in quietly, his expression thoughtful. After a few bites, he asked, "Are you going to take me back to the shelter today?" Nate froze. He hadn't thought that far ahead. The logical answer was yes. He had no business taking care of a child, especially a child with this much uncertainty surrounding him. But the idea of dropping Danny back into a system where he might slip through the cracks made something tighten in Nate's chest. No, he said finally. Not yet. Danny's chewing slowed. He swallowed and looked up at Nate carefully. Why? Because I don't know what to do with you. Because I need answers. Because for some reason I can't bring myself to let you go just yet. Instead, he said, because I need to know more first. Danny nodded, as if that made sense to him. Then he asked something that made Nate's stomach drop. Did you know my mom? Nate gripped his coffee mug, his throat tightening. Yes, he said quietly. I did. Danny studied him. Did you love her? Nate inhaled sharply. The question felt too big, too raw, especially coming from this boy who had no idea what he was unraveling. Yes, Nate admitted. I loved her very much. Danny absorbed that, then returned his attention to his food. He didn't ask anything else, but his silence carried weight. He was trying to piece things together, just as Nate was. A few hours later, Nate received a call from Tyler Graves. I found something, the investigator said without preamble, about the kid. Nate's grip on his phone tightened. Tell me. There's no listed father on his birth certificate, Tyler said. His mother's name is Claire Whitmore. Nate closed his eyes. Confirmation. A reality he wasn't ready for but had known deep down. There's more, Tyler continued. Claire visited the shelter for years. I pulled security footage. She was there every few months, bringing supplies, checking in on the boy. She didn't just abandon him, Nate. She cared. Nate's chest constricted. Claire had known. She had been there, and yet she had never told him. Why didn't she tell me? Nate muttered, more to himself than Tyler. I don't know, Tyler admitted, but I'll keep digging. Nate hung up, staring at his phone. His hands felt numb, his mind spinning. Claire had loved Danny. She had visited him. So why had she kept him a secret? What had she been afraid of? A quiet voice pulled him from his thoughts. Are you okay? Nate looked up to see Danny standing there, his small hands curled into the sleeves of his hoodie. His blue eyes, Claire's eyes, were filled with something hesitant, a cautious concern. And in that moment, Nate knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Not ever. Nathaniel Whitmore wasn't a man who liked loose ends. Every problem had a solution, every uncertainty a way to be controlled. But as he sat in his sleek, modern office, staring at the security footage Tyler Graves had sent him, he felt something foreign settle in his chest. Unease. On the screen, grainy black and white footage showed Claire walking into the Brooklyn shelter. She looked different than he remembered. The poised, elegant woman he had married was absent. Instead, she wore simple jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. No designer brands, no expensive jewelry. Just Claire, stripped down to someone he barely recognized. And there, sitting across from her in the small, dimly lit room, was Danny. She reached across the table, brushing his curls back gently, her lips moving as if she were whispering something just for him. Danny, so much smaller then, had leaned into her touch, his tiny fingers clutching at hers like she was the only anchor in his world. Nate swallowed hard. Claire had loved him. She had never forgotten him. And yet, she had never told Nate, never let him into this part of her life. A sharp knock at his office door yanked him from his thoughts. He minimized the video just as Rebecca Hayes stepped inside, a neatly organized folder in her hands. "You called for me?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. "And before noon? Must be serious." Nate pinched the bridge of his nose. Rebecca had been his assistant for 6 years. She was efficient, sharp, and the only person in his life who didn't tiptoe around him. "I need you to set up a meeting with the director of St. Agnes Shelter," he said, keeping his voice even. "As soon as possible." Rebecca frowned, flipping open the folder she had brought in. St. Agnes? Why? I mean, I can do it, obviously, but... Her eyes flicked to his. This about the kid? He exhaled slowly. Yes. Rebecca pursed her lips. So let me get this straight. You found out your dead wife had a secret child, and instead of running in the opposite direction like a normal, emotionally unavailable billionaire, you're what? Investigating? I need answers, he said tightly. Rebecca studied him for a long moment before sighing. Fine. I'll set it up, but I'll be coming with you. His brow furrowed. Why? Because I don't trust you not to bulldoze your way in there like you own the place. She gave him a pointed look. And because, despite your best efforts, you have no idea how to talk to actual humans outside of corporate boardrooms. Nate huffed, but didn't argue. Truthfully, he didn't mind having Rebecca there. She was good at reading people, at spotting deception where he might overlook it. Fine, he said. Make the call. That afternoon, Nate and Rebecca walked into St. Agnes' shelter, the scent of disinfectant and old carpet hitting him the moment they stepped inside. The woman at the front desk, a tired-looking woman in her 60s, glanced up from her paperwork. Can I help you? She asked warily. Nate straightened. Nathaniel Whitmore. I called ahead. Her eyes flicked between him and Rebecca, then nodded toward the hallway. Miss Jones' office is the third door on the left. Miss Joan, the woman Danny had mentioned, the one who had told him about Claire. Nate's pulse quickened as they made their way down the hall. The shelter was clean but worn, the walls lined with faded posters about child welfare and community support. The kind of place that did its best with very little. Rebecca knocked once before pushing the office door open. Inside, a petite woman with gray-streaked brown hair looked up from behind a cluttered desk. Mr. Whitmore, she said, standing and offering a handshake. I'm Miss Joan. Nate shook her hand, then got straight to the point. I need to know everything you can tell me about Danny. Miss Jones sighed, settling back into her chair. I figured this day would come. She gestured to the two chairs across from her desk, and Nate and Rebecca sat. Danny's been here since he was a baby, Miss Jones started. Claire brought him to us herself, told us she couldn't keep him, but that she loved him, that she would visit as much as she could. Nate's jaw clenched. Why? Miss Joan hesitated. She didn't say exactly, just that she had no other choice. His hands curled into fists. Claire had never been helpless. She had always fought for what she wanted. So what had made her believe she couldn't keep her own child? She kept coming, Miss Joan continued. For years. Every few months she'd be here. She brought him books, clothes, sat with him for hours. She never stopped loving him, Mr. Whitmore. Even when she stopped coming right before she died, I knew it wasn't because she didn't care. Nate swallowed against the tightness in his throat. Why didn't she tell me? Miss Joan gave him a knowing look. Only she could answer that. But if I had to guess, she was protecting him, and maybe even you. That landed like a punch to the gut. Rebecca, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. Did she ever say anything about Danny's father? Miss Joan nodded. Not much, but enough. She pulled open a drawer and took out a single sheet of paper. It was old, the edges worn. She slid it across the desk to Nate. He picked it up, scanning the brief, hastily written words. If anything happens to me, tell him the truth. But be careful. He can't know until it's safe. It wasn't signed. But the handwriting was Claire's. The air in the room thickened. Rebecca leaned in, reading over his shoulder. That's vague as hell. Nate's mind raced. The truth about what? Who was she protecting Danny from? He looked up at Miss Joan, his expression tight. Did she ever mention his biological father? Miss Joan hesitated, then nodded. Once. She said he was powerful, dangerous, that he couldn't find out about Danny. A slow, cold realization settled in Nate's chest. Whoever Danny's father was, Claire had feared him, which meant that Nate wasn't just uncovering a past he never knew existed. He was walking straight into a storm. Nathaniel Whitmore had built his life on control over his company, his wealth, his emotions. But as he walked out of St. Agnes' shelter with Rebecca at his side, he felt anything but in control. The note. If anything happens to me, tell him the truth. But be careful. He can't know until it's safe. Claire had written those words knowing she might never be able to explain them herself. She had kept Danny's existence from him, not out of indifference but out of fear. That fear had been tied to Danny's father, a man she had believed was too dangerous to know the truth, which meant that whoever he was, Nate had just put a target on his back. Rebecca kept pace beside him as they exited the shelter, her usual sharp, businesslike demeanor uncharacteristically subdued. She had been with him for years, seen him at his best and worst. But this was different. This wasn't a hostile takeover or a boardroom scandal. This was personal. So, she said, finally breaking the silence. What now? Nate exhaled slowly. Tyler needs to dig deeper. Claire kept this from me for a reason, and I need to know what that reason was. Rebecca studied him. And Danny? Nate's jaw tightened. He's staying with me. Something flickered in Rebecca's gaze, something Nate couldn't quite place. You sure about that? You barely know the kid. Nate didn't hesitate. I know enough. Rebecca sighed. All right then. I'll have some things sent over to your penthouse. Kid-friendly groceries, some clothes, stuff he actually needs. He gave her a nod, appreciating that she didn't push further. Rebecca might challenge him at every turn, but she knew when to step back. He just wished he knew what the hell he was stepping into. By the time Nate returned to the penthouse, the sun had started its descent over Manhattan, casting the skyline in hues of amber and deep blue. He wasn't used to coming home before the city lights took over the darkness. Inside, Danny sat curled on the couch, his small hands gripping a book far too thick for his age. His hair was still damp from a shower, and the oversized clothes Rebecca had sent over earlier made him look even smaller than he was. For a brief moment, Nate just watched him, trying to reconcile everything in his mind. This boy, this child who had suddenly become his responsibility, had spent years in a shelter, living on scraps of his mother's love, while Nate had spent those same years grieving the woman who had lied to him. It wasn't fair. None of it was. Hey, kid. Danny looked up. Hey. Nate crossed the room and sat on the chair opposite him. What are you reading? Danny hesitated before holding up the book. The Count of Monte Cristo. Nate raised an eyebrow. That's ambitious. Danny shrugged. Miss Jones said I should read the classics. Nate smirked. She tell you it's about revenge? Danny gave a small, barely there smile. She left that part out. Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but thick with unspoken words. Finally, Danny shut the book and shifted in his seat. Did you know my mom? Nate inhaled deeply. Yeah. Danny fidgeted with the book's spine. Did you love her? Nate's throat tightened. He had already answered this question once, but it felt different now, hearing it again from Claire's son. Yes, he said. I loved her very much. Danny was quiet for a long moment. Then, almost too soft to hear, he said, Then why didn't she tell you about me? Nate clenched his jaw. He had asked himself that same question 100 times since finding Danny at Claire's grave. He had no answer that would make sense to a 6-year-old. I don't know, he admitted, but I intend to find out. Danny nodded, as if accepting that answer. But Nate could see it. The lingering doubt, the uncertainty that came from years of feeling like an afterthought. It twisted something deep inside him. He had never considered himself a father, had never imagined being responsible for someone other than himself. But as he looked at Danny, he realized something unsettling. He wanted to be. The next morning, Tyler Graves called. "I found him," the investigator said without preamble. Nate straightened in his chair. "Who?" "Danny's biological father." A cold weight settled in Nate's chest. "Who is he?" Tyler hesitated for half a second. "Mark Donovan." The name hit Nate like a gut punch. Mark Donovan wasn't just anyone. He was a billionaire real estate mogul, ruthless in his business dealings, feared in corporate circles. A man who played the long game, waiting until the right moment to strike. And now, Nate knew why Claire had been afraid. "Are you sure?" Nate asked, though he already knew the answer. "The records were sealed, but I dug into some older databases. Claire filed a paternity request when Danny was an infant. The request was never followed up on, but the name she listed was Mark Donovan." Nate leaned forward, gripping the edge of his desk. "Does Donovan know?" "No," Tyler said, "not as far as I can tell. But if he finds out—" "He won't," Nate cut in. His mind was already working through the possibilities, the dangers. "Not until I decide how to handle this." Tyler was silent for a moment before he asked, "What are you going to do?" Nate looked toward the hallway where Danny was still asleep, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. "I'm going to protect him," he said simply, "no matter what." That evening, Nate sat at the dining table across from Danny. A meal had been placed in front of him, grilled chicken, vegetables, something healthy. But Danny was more interested in pushing his food around than eating it. "You don't like it?" Nate asked. Danny shrugged. "I'm just not used to eating with someone." Nate exhaled slowly. "Get used to it." Danny blinked at him. "Are you going to keep me here?" The directness of the question caught Nate off guard. He set his fork down, meeting Danny's gaze head-on. "Do you want to stay?" Danny hesitated, glancing away. "I don't know. I like it here, but I don't want to be in the way." Nate's chest tightened. He had spent years dealing with men who would kill to be in his presence, who would bend over backward to be a part of his world. And yet, here was this small boy who thought he was nothing more than an inconvenience. "You're not in the way, Danny," he said, his voice firm. "You belong here." Danny looked at him for a long moment, searching for something in Nate's face. Then, slowly, he nodded. For the first time since this had all started, Nate felt something settle inside him. He had made his decision. Danny wasn't going anywhere. Nathaniel Whitmore had led some of the most complicated business negotiations in the country. He had orchestrated billion-dollar mergers, outmaneuvered ruthless competitors, and turned Whitmore Innovations into a titan of the tech industry. But nothing, not his Ivy League education, not years of high-stakes decision-making, had prepared him for a 6-year-old boy. 2 weeks had passed since Danny moved into the penthouse, and in that time, Nate had learned a hard truth. Children were exhausting. Danny was quiet, but not in the way Nate had expected. It wasn't just shyness or uncertainty. It was something deeper. A cautiousness that hadn't faded, even as the days passed. He was polite, never outright defiant, but there was a hesitancy in him that made Nate's chest ache. And then there were the practical challenges. Danny was a child, which meant he needed things Nate had never thought about before: routine, structure, emotional reassurance. The first night, Nate had assumed Danny would just go to bed when he was tired. Instead, he had found the boy sitting in the dimly lit hallway, knees drawn to his chest, staring blankly at the floor. "I don't know when to sleep," Danny had whispered when Nate asked him what was wrong. At the shelter, lights out had been at a strict time. But here, no one had told him what to do. The realization had settled like a weight in Nate's chest. Danny had spent his whole life waiting for permission just to exist. That night, Nate had sat with him until he fell asleep. And from that night on, they established a routine: dinner, reading, bedtime at 9 p.m. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. "Okay, kid, what do you want for breakfast?" Nate asked one morning as he stood in the kitchen, scanning the contents of his newly stocked fridge. Danny sat at the counter, swinging his legs back and forth. "Can I have pancakes?" Nate hesitated. "I don't know how to make pancakes." Danny blinked. "You don't?" "I run a billion-dollar company, Danny. I don't have time to cook." Danny frowned. "Pancakes aren't cooking. Pancakes are just pancakes." Nate exhaled and reached for his phone. "I'll have someone send some over." Danny's face fell. "I don't want pancakes from a restaurant. I want pancakes from here." Nate looked at him, then at the stove. Well, how hard could pancakes be? 30 minutes and a batter explosion later, he realized the answer was very hard. Danny giggled as Nate wiped flour off his sleeve. "You're really bad at this." Nate scowled. Yeah, laugh it up." The pancakes were a disaster, half burned, half undercooked, but Danny ate them anyway, smiling as he chewed. And for the first time since all of this started, Nate felt something unfamiliar. Contentment. Later that day, Nate had a meeting scheduled, but Rebecca intercepted him in the hallway before he could leave. "You can't go into the office today." Nate frowned. "Why not?" Rebecca crossed her arms. "Because your "I run a billion-dollar company" excuse doesn't work when there's something more important." He narrowed his eyes. "Rebecca." She held up a hand. "Danny has a doctor's appointment, first one since he got here. And guess what, boss? You're taking him." Nate exhaled sharply. "I can have someone—" "No." Her voice was firm. "He needs you. Not a driver, not a bodyguard. You." Nate pinched the bridge of his nose. "Fine." An hour later, Nate found himself sitting in the waiting room of one of the top pediatric clinics in the city, feeling more out of place than he ever had in his life. Danny sat beside him, flipping through a book Rebecca had handed him on the way out. He seemed calm, but his fingers were clenched tightly around the pages. Nate leaned back in his chair, watching the boy. "You nervous?" Danny shook his head. "No." Nate arched a brow. "You sure?" Danny hesitated, then nodded again, but his grip on the book told a different story. Nate sighed and ran a hand through his hair. He wasn't good at this. He didn't know how to do reassuring, how to do gentle, but he knew how to be honest. "You know, when I was a kid, I hated going to the doctor," Nate admitted. "I thought they were going to find something wrong every time." Danny glanced up at him. "Did they?" "Nope. Turns out I was fine. And you will be too." Danny studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Nate had no idea if he had actually reassured him, but when Danny's hands finally relaxed around the book, he considered it a win. The doctor's visit went smoother than expected. Danny was healthy, though slightly underweight. "Nothing some good meals and a stable home can't fix," the doctor had said. Stable home. The words lingered in Nate's mind as he drove Danny back to the penthouse. Was this a home now? Could it be? That evening, as Nate settled in his office, his phone buzzed. It was Tyler. "You're not going to like this," the investigator said the moment Nate picked up. Nate exhaled. "What is it?" "Mark Donovan." Nate's grip tightened around his phone. "What about him?" "He knows." A beat of silence. Then Nate stood, already pacing. "How?" "I don't know," Tyler admitted. "But word is he's been making inquiries. He's digging." A slow, simmering rage built in Nate's chest. Mark Donovan wasn't just dangerous because of his money. He was dangerous because he didn't stop until he got what he wanted. And now, he wanted Danny. "He's going to come for him," Nate muttered, half to himself. Tyler's voice was grim. "Yeah, and you need to be ready." Nate hung up, his mind racing. His life had changed overnight with the discovery of Danny, and now that life was under threat. He turned toward the hallway where Danny was watching TV, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Nate's jaw clenched. He had promised to protect Danny. And Nathaniel Whitmore never broke a promise. Nathaniel Whitmore wasn't used to being outmaneuvered. But as he stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, watching Rebecca and Danny work side by side, he realized he'd been played. Rebecca had come over under the guise of checking in on a few work matters. She had taken one look at Nate, exhausted and irritable from juggling Danny's needs and his corporate responsibilities, and promptly decided that he needed help. And then, without waiting for an invitation, she had rolled up her sleeves and taken over his kitchen. Now Danny stood beside her on a step stool, sleeves rolled up, his small hands carefully stirring a bowl of pancake batter. Rebecca gave him instructions with an ease that Nate couldn't begin to match. The kid was hanging on to her every word. Nate leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You're aware that you don't actually live here, right?" Rebecca didn't even look up. "Funny. I was just about to remind you that you don't actually know how to parent." Nate scowled. "I'm figuring it out." "Are you?" she said, arching a brow before returning her attention to Danny. "Because based on the disaster I saw in your fridge, I'd say you're barely surviving." "I'm busy running a company," Nate muttered. "Right. And that worked perfectly before. But guess what? You've got a kid now, so unless you want him eating protein bars and overpriced takeout for the rest of his life, you might want to step it up." Danny snorted, clearly enjoying the banter. "The last pancakes he made were kinda burned." Rebecca smirked. "See? Even he agrees." Nate sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't going to win this argument. "Fine, just—" He waved a hand at the mess of flour and eggs coating his kitchen island. "Try not to destroy my house." Rebecca grinned. "No promises." A few hours later, after a successful pancake breakfast that actually tasted edible for once, Rebecca had settled into the living room with Danny while Nate took a call in his office. It wasn't about work this time. "What's the latest on Donovan?" Nate asked, gripping the phone. Tyler Graves sighed on the other end. "He's digging hard. He's looking for any legal claim he can make. Does he have anything?" Nate's voice was sharp. "Not yet, but he has resources, and if he finds out Claire listed him on the paternity records, even unofficially, he's going to come at you with everything he's got." Nate clenched his jaw. He had been prepared for corporate attacks, media exposure, even a financial war if necessary. But a legal battle over Danny? That was a different kind of fight. "Keep digging," Nate ordered. "Find me something I can use." "I'll do what I can. But be careful, Nate. If Donovan makes a move, it won't be subtle." Nate ended the call, his grip tightening around his phone. He exhaled, forcing himself to push down the rage burning in his chest. When he returned to the living room, he found Rebecca and Danny sitting on the couch, flipping through an old photo album he hadn't even realized was in the house. "Where did you find that?" he asked, narrowing his eyes at Rebecca. She shrugged. Danny wanted to know more about his mom, figured this was a good place to start. Nate's gaze flickered to the album. The pages were filled with photos of Claire, smiling at charity events, caught mid-laugh at some gala, sitting on the beach during one of their rare vacations. Danny traced a picture of her with his small fingers. She was really pretty. "She was," Nate agreed, his voice quieter than usual. Danny looked up. "Do you miss her?" The question hit harder than it should have. Nate had spent years burying his grief under work. telling himself that moving forward was the only option. But standing here, looking at Claire's son, their son, he realized he had never really faced it. "Yeah," he admitted. "I do." Danny nodded as if he understood. Maybe he did. Maybe in his own way he had been missing her just as much. Rebecca watched them carefully before she spoke. "You know, for a man who claims he's bad at this, you're doing all right." Nate arched a brow. "That's supposed to be a compliment?" "Take it however you want," she said with a small smirk. "But I mean it. You're trying. And that counts for something." Danny smiled at that, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Nate felt something shift. This wasn't just about protecting Danny anymore. This was about being a father, and he wasn't going to fail. That night, as Nate was tucking Danny into bed, the boy hesitated before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" Nate sat on the edge of the bed. "Of course." Danny fidgeted with the blanket. "Are you going to keep me?" Nate's heart clenched. He had spent his whole life making calculated decisions, weighing risks, and ensuring he was always one step ahead. But this? This was the easiest answer he had ever given. "Yes," he said firmly. "You're staying here, for as long as you want." Danny studied him for a long moment before nodding. And then, for the first time, he reached out, just slightly, and rested his small hand on Nate's. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. Nate squeezed his hand gently before standing up. "Good night, Danny." "Good night," the boy murmured. As Nate stepped out into the hallway, he found Rebecca leaning against the wall, watching him with an unreadable expression. "What?" he asked. She smirked. "I think you just became a dad, Whitmore." Nate huffed. "Yeah, guess I did." And for the first time in a long time, it didn't terrify him at all. Nathaniel Whitmore was not a man who scared easily. He had built an empire in one of the most cutthroat industries, outmaneuvering rivals who would do anything to see him fail. He had faced legal battles, corporate espionage, and scandals meant to destroy his name. But none of it compared to the quiet dread settling in his gut now. Mark Donovan knew about Danny. That single fact had the power to upend everything Nate had built over the last few weeks. He sat in his office, gripping his phone as Tyler Graves's voice echoed in his ear. "I've confirmed it," the investigator said grimly. "Donovan's people have been digging into the shelter records, and I'd bet good money that he knows Danny exists. If he hasn't made a move yet, it's only a matter of time." Nate leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "What's his endgame?" "He never lifted a finger for that kid before." Tyler hesitated. "Donovan's been hemorrhaging money. He's still powerful, but his empire isn't as bulletproof as it used to be. If he's looking at Danny now, it might not be about the kid. It might be about leverage." A muscle ticked in Nate's jaw. "Leverage against me? Or against the courts? If he's smart, he'll spin this into some redemption story. Long-lost father reclaims his son. That kind of thing plays well in the media, and if he gets public sympathy, you can bet he'll push for full custody." Nate exhaled slowly, rage simmering beneath the surface. He would not let that happen. "Then we cut him off before he makes a move," Nate said coldly. "Find out everything you can about his financial situation. If he's vulnerable, I want to know where to hit him." Tyler grunted. "You got it. But Nate, be careful. Donovan isn't just some boardroom rival. If he's desperate, he'll fight dirty." Nate ended the call and stared out the window of his penthouse. The city stretched before him, glittering with power and opportunity. It was his world. He had built it from nothing. And now, he would protect it. More importantly, he would protect Danny. The next morning, Nate was unusually quiet as he sipped his coffee. Danny sat across from him, kicking his legs against the stool as he ate his cereal. Rebecca, who had been stopping by more frequently since Danny arrived, studied Nate carefully before setting down her tablet. "All right, Whitmore." "Spill." Nate arched a brow. "Spill what?" Rebecca gave him an unimpressed look. "You're brooding. And I know that look. That's your someone's about to die in a hostile takeover look. So who is it?" Danny blinked between them, spoon halfway to his mouth. "Are you going to take over a company?" he asked, eyes wide with curiosity. Nate smirked despite himself. "No, kid, not today." Rebecca crossed her arms. "Then what is it?" Nate hesitated. He hadn't told her about Donovan yet, but if there was anyone he trusted to help navigate this storm, it was her. "Danny's biological father knows about him," he said finally, "and I think he's going to come after custody." Rebecca's easygoing demeanor vanished in an instant. "Excuse me?" Nate set his mug down, keeping his voice even. "Donovan is looking for an angle. He has money, but he's bleeding it. He's desperate, and I think he sees Danny as an asset, not a son." Rebecca's eyes darkened. If that bastard thinks he can waltz in and claim him just because he's got money, he's got another thing coming. Nate exhaled slowly. "Which is why I need to be ready. I need to be his legal guardian before Donovan makes a move." Danny, who had been quiet through most of the conversation, spoke up suddenly. "What happens if he wins?" Both adults turned to him. Nate's chest tightened. He hated that Danny even had to ask that question. "He won't win," Nate said firmly. "I won't let him." Danny looked down at his cereal, pushing it around with his spoon. "But what if you can't stop him?" Rebecca stood abruptly. "All right, new rule. No more talking about worst-case scenarios over breakfast. Danny, go grab your shoes. I'm taking you to the park." Danny slid off the stool and disappeared down the hall, leaving Nate and Rebecca alone. She turned to him, her sharp brown eyes blazing. "You need to move fast, Whitmore. Courts don't like billionaires swooping in out of nowhere. You need proof that you're what's best for Danny." "And how do I do that?" Rebecca smirked. "By showing them that you're already a father to him." Later that evening, after Danny had gone to bed, Nate sat in his office, scrolling through legal documents on his laptop when his phone buzzed. A message from Tyler. "Turn on the news." Frowning, Nate grabbed the remote and switched to a business channel. And there, staring back at him from the screen, was Mark Donovan. The headline made Nate's blood turn to ice. Mark Donovan breaks his silence. "I just want my son back." Nate turned up the volume as the broadcast cut to Donovan standing on the steps of a courthouse, microphones shoved in his face. "I didn't know," Donovan said, his voice thick with feigned emotion. "I had no idea I had a son. If I had known, I would have done everything to be there for him. Now that I do, I just want a chance to be in his life." Nate's grip on the remote tightened as a reporter chimed in. "What do you say to those who claim that you abandoned him?" Donovan put on his best remorseful expression. "I don't blame them. I blame myself for not being there. But now that I know the truth, I want to do right by my son. I hope Nathaniel Whitmore understands that." The screen cut back to the anchor, but Nate wasn't listening anymore. His blood was boiling. This was it. The opening shot in the war. Donovan wasn't just coming for Danny. He was coming for Nate's reputation, too. A soft knock at the door made him look up. Danny stood there, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "I heard the TV. What happened?" Nate forced his anger down, giving Danny a small, reassuring smile. "Nothing you need to worry about, kid." Danny hesitated before shuffling forward. "I don't want to go with him." Nate exhaled, his chest tightening. He crouched in front of Danny, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You're not going anywhere, Danny. I promise." Danny looked up at him, searching his face, before finally nodding. "Okay." As Nate tucked him back into bed, he made a silent vow. Donovan had declared war, and Nate would make damn sure he lost. Nathaniel Whitmore had expected Mark Donovan to play dirty, but seeing his enemy manipulate the media with calculated charm was enough to make his blood boil. He stood in the boardroom of Whitmore Innovations, his hands pressed firmly against the glass conference table as he watched the news replay Donovan's speech for the third time that morning. "Turn it off." Rebecca grabbed the remote and shut off the television, crossing her arms. "Well, that was a steaming pile of—" "We knew this was coming," Nate interrupted, his voice tight. "The question is, how do we shut it down before it gains traction?" Across the table, his legal team exchanged wary glances. "There's no immediate legal action he can take," said Martin Hale, Nate's top attorney. "Not without proof that he's Danny's biological father. But if he petitions the court for a paternity test, it could force your hand." "And once he has proof?" Nate asked, his jaw tightening. Martin sighed. "He could push for custody. If the court believes Danny would be better off with his biological father, you'd have a problem," Rebecca scoffed. "Better off?" "The man's a vulture. He's using this kid as a last-ditch effort to salvage his empire." "Public opinion matters," Martin warned. "If Donovan frames this as a redemption story, he might sway the courts." Nate exhaled sharply. He had built his career on controlling the narrative, ensuring that the world only saw what he wanted them to see. But this wasn't just business. This was personal. "What if we cut him off financially?" Rebecca suggested. "If he's bleeding money, he's vulnerable. Maybe we hit him where it hurts." Nate considered it. "Tyler's looking into his finances now. If Donovan's weak, I want to know exactly how to make him fall." Martin cleared his throat. "There's one other thing to consider." Nate looked at him sharply. "Spit it out." "You need to formalize your guardianship over Danny. Right now, there's no legal record tying you to him. If Donovan gets ahead of us, the court could see him as the default parent." Rebecca frowned. "So what does he need to do?" "You need to petition for legal guardianship or adoption," Martin said. "And fast." Nate's stomach tightened. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. "Start the paperwork," he ordered, "and make sure Donovan doesn't get a step ahead." Martin nodded. "I'll get on it." As the meeting adjourned, Rebecca lingered behind, watching him carefully. "You okay?" she asked. Nate pinched the bridge of his nose. "Number, but I don't have time to not be." Rebecca sighed. "You know, for a guy who avoids emotional attachments, you're really throwing yourself into this." He shot her a glare. "He's my son." Rebecca smiled slightly. "Yeah, I know." That evening, Nate returned to the penthouse, his mind still racing with legal strategies and contingency plans. But the moment he stepped inside, the weight of the day seemed to lift just slightly. Danny sat on the floor with a puzzle spread out in front of him, his brows furrowed in concentration. When he looked up and saw Nate, he grinned. "Hey." "Hey, kid." Nate set his briefcase down and walked over, crouching beside him. "What's this?" Danny pushed a piece into place. "It's supposed to be a city skyline." Nate smirked. "Looks more like abstract art right now." Danny laughed, then hesitated. "Are you busy?" Nate exhaled. "Not right now." Danny brightened. "Want to help?" Nate hesitated. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Probably another update on Donovan, another crisis waiting to be dealt with. But for the first time in a long time, he ignored it. "Yeah," he said, picking up a puzzle piece. "I think I do." Danny beamed, and something in Nate's chest loosened. For all the battles waiting outside this penthouse, this was what mattered, and he wasn't going to lose. Nathaniel Whitmore had spent his entire career predicting the next move of his rivals. Anticipation was his weapon, control his armor. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. The news broke in the late afternoon. Nate was in his office, reviewing the guardianship paperwork, when his phone buzzed. Rebecca's name flashed across the screen. "You need to see this, now." Her tone was sharp, urgent. Nate switched on the television. The screen filled with the image of Mark Donovan, seated in an exclusive interview, his expression carefully crafted into that of a heartbroken father. The lower third of the broadcast read, "Mark Donovan speaks out. Billionaire Nathaniel Whitmore is keeping my son from me." Nate's grip tightened around his glass as Donovan sighed dramatically before addressing the camera. "I've made mistakes in my past," Donovan admitted, voice thick with emotion. "But no one told me I had a son. No one gave me the chance to be a father." He glanced down, as if composing himself. "And now Nathaniel Whitmore, a man with no legal claim, has taken my boy." A montage of carefully curated photos played. Images of Danny at the shelter, alone, looking small and vulnerable. The narrative was clear. Mark Donovan, the wronged father. Nate, the powerful billionaire who had snatched a child away from his real family. Rebecca swore under her breath. "He's painting you as the villain. The public's eating it up." Nate stayed silent, his mind already working through the consequences. "Whitmore doesn't know what it means to be a parent," Donovan continued. "He sees Danny as a project, a business decision. But I see my son, and I will fight for him." Nate set his glass down before he shattered it. A reporter chimed in. "What about Danny's mother? What would Claire Whitmore want?" Donovan's expression darkened, but his voice remained steady. "Claire and I made mistakes, but she would want our son to be with his real father." Nate exhaled sharply. The bastard was rewriting history. Rebecca muted the television. "This changes things." Nate's jaw tightened. "Number it doesn't." Rebecca's eyes flashed. "Nate, the courts care about public perception. And right now, Donovan is making you look like an arrogant billionaire stealing a child from his rightful father. You need to hit back. Hard." "I'm not turning this into a spectacle," Nate said. "You might not have a choice." His phone rang again. This time, it was Martin Hale. Nate answered. "We have a problem," the lawyer said, confirming what Nate already knew. "Donovan's attorneys just filed for emergency custody." Rebecca swore. Nate clenched his jaw. "How soon before this reaches a judge?" "They're pushing for a preliminary hearing by the end of the week." Nate inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay calm. "What's our position?" "You have no legal standing, yet. We're filing the guardianship claim, but it won't process in time. Right now, Donovan has a stronger case in the eyes of the law." Nate's grip on the phone tightened. "Then we make sure the court sees the truth before he has a chance to manipulate them." That night, Nate sat on the edge of Danny's bed, watching as the boy slept. How could a man like Donovan claim to be a father? He had ignored Danny's existence for years, yet now, when it was convenient, he wanted to play the role of the loving parent. Danny stirred slightly, blinking up at him. "You're still here." Nate offered a small smile. "Yeah, kid, I'm here." Danny sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Is something wrong?" Nate hesitated. "Just some grown-up problems. Nothing for you to worry about." Danny studied him for a moment, then looked down at his blanket. "I heard some of it. About Mr. Donovan." Nate exhaled, not surprised. Danny was quiet, but he wasn't oblivious. "He says he's my dad." Danny's voice was small, uncertain. "But I don't know him. I don't remember him." Nate felt something tighten in his chest. "You don't have to go anywhere, Danny. I'm going to fight for you." Danny nodded slowly, but didn't seem convinced. "What if they make me go?" Nate's throat tightened. He had no answer for that, but he wouldn't lie to the kid. "No matter what happens, I won't stop fighting for you." His voice was firm. "You're not alone in this." Danny hesitated before inching closer, and then, in a move that caught Nate completely off guard, he rested his small head against Nate's side. It was the first time Danny had sought comfort from him, the first sign that he wasn't just tolerating Nate's presence. He was beginning to trust him. Nate swallowed past the lump in his throat and wrapped an arm around the boy. They sat in silence for a long moment before Danny whispered, "I don't want to go with him." Nate closed his eyes, determination hardening inside him. "You won't." And this time, it wasn't just a promise, it was a vow. Nathaniel Whitmore had never walked into a fight unprepared. Whether it was a corporate takeover or a high-stakes negotiation, he always ensured he had the upper hand before stepping into the battlefield. This time, the battlefield was a courtroom. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, he stood at the defense table, his expression unreadable as the judge called the emergency custody hearing to order. Across from him, Mark Donovan sat with his high-powered legal team, looking every bit the concerned father. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back, whispering behind their notepads, while cameras from outside news crews flashed through the narrow windows. Rebecca sat behind him, arms crossed, her expression carefully neutral. She had wanted to say something, likely something biting about Donovan's ability to manipulate the press, but she knew better than to add fuel to the fire before the hearing even began. Danny wasn't present. Thank God. The last thing Nate wanted was for the kid to be dragged into this circus. The judge, a woman in her late 60s with a sharp gaze, adjusted her glasses before addressing the courtroom. "Mr. Donovan, your petition claims that Mr. Whitmore has unlawfully taken custody of your biological son, Daniel Brooks, and is preventing you from establishing a relationship with him. Is that correct?" Donovan nodded solemnly. "Yes, Your Honor. I only recently learned that I had a son. Had I known earlier, I would have been there for him. Now that I do know, I want to do right by him. I just want the chance to be his father." Nate clenched his jaw. The performance was flawless, just the right mix of regret and sincerity. The bastard had been coached well. The judge turned her attention to Nate's lawyer. "Mr. Hale, how does your client respond?" Martin Hale stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, while Mr. Donovan may claim he wants a relationship with Danny, his actions tell a different story. He was absent for 6 years. He provided no support, no attempts to seek out the child, and only now, when Mr. Whitmore has stepped in, does he show interest." Donovan's lawyer, a slick-looking man in a charcoal suit, leaned forward. "Your Honor, my client did not know about his son. He cannot be held accountable for something that was hidden from him." Hale didn't hesitate. "Your Honor, we have evidence that Claire Whitmore, Danny's mother, feared for her son's safety. She did not want Donovan involved in his life." The judge's brow lifted slightly. "And what evidence is this?" Martin turned to Rebecca, who handed him a file. He walked forward, presenting the judge with a copy of Claire's handwritten note, the one she had left at the shelter. The judge read over it carefully. "If anything happens to me, tell him the truth. But be careful. He can't know until it's safe." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Donovan's lawyer quickly stood. "Your Honor, this is a vague statement, one that doesn't explicitly name my client as a threat." Hale didn't back down. "It does establish that Claire was protecting Danny from someone, and it is highly relevant given Mr. Donovan's history of legal troubles and corporate misconduct." The judge raised a hand, silencing the room. "I will review this document. However, the concern at hand is who can provide the best home for this child." She turned to Donovan. "Mr. Donovan, if granted custody, how do you intend to care for Danny?" Donovan straightened, his voice measured. "Danny will have everything he needs. A stable home, the best education, a future filled with opportunities. I may have made mistakes in my past, but I have changed. I want to give my son the life he deserves." Nate had to suppress a scoff. The life he deserves? If Donovan had truly cared about Danny's well-being, he wouldn't be using him as a pawn in a desperate power grab. The judge then turned her attention to Nate. "And Mr. Whitmore?" Nate rose smoothly. Unlike Donovan, he didn't need theatrics. He only needed the truth. "I never expected to be a father," he admitted, his voice steady. "But the moment I found out about Danny, I made a choice. Not because it was convenient, not because it was expected, but because he needed someone to show up for him." He let that settle before continuing. "Danny has spent his whole life being passed around, never knowing where he truly belongs. He doesn't need a man who suddenly decided to care when it was convenient. He needs stability. He needs someone who will put him first, no matter what." Rebecca nodded approvingly behind him. Even Martin looked impressed. The judge observed him for a long moment before shifting her attention back to the lawyers. "I will review both petitions carefully before making a decision. Until then, there will be no changes to Danny's current living arrangements." A temporary win, but not a victory. The gavel came down, and the hearing was adjourned. The moment the judge left, Donovan stood, smoothing his suit as he stepped toward Nate. "Noble speech," Donovan said, his tone deceptively pleasant. "But you and I both know this isn't over." Nate met his gaze, unwavering. "You're right, it's not. But I promise you this, Danny is not your bargaining chip." Donovan's smile was sharp. "We'll see about that." As he turned and walked away, Rebecca muttered, "I hate that guy." Nate's jaw tightened. "Get in line." Later that night, Nate returned home to find Danny sitting in the living room, waiting for him. The boy looked up, his expression cautious. "Did you win?" Nate sat beside him, loosening his tie. "Not yet, but we're going to." Danny nodded, though he still looked uncertain. "He's not going to take me, right?" Nate felt something fierce rise in his chest. He reached over, resting a reassuring hand on Danny's shoulder. "No one is taking you from me." Danny hesitated, then did something he had never done before. He scooted closer, leaning slightly against Nate's side. It was small, tentative, but it was trust. And Nathaniel Whitmore would fight like hell to protect it. Nathaniel Whitmore had fought many battles in his life. He had outmaneuvered ruthless CEOs, survived hostile takeovers, and built an empire through sheer force of will. But none of those victories mattered as much as the one he was fighting now. This wasn't about business. This was about family. The judge's decision was coming soon, and Nate knew it could go either way. Despite his resources, despite the truth, he had learned that in court, perception mattered just as much as facts, and Donovan had played his part well. Now, all Nate could do was ensure he stayed ahead. The morning after the hearing, Tyler Graves arrived at the penthouse with a grim look on his face. Rebecca sat beside Nate at the dining table, her arms crossed tightly as she sipped her coffee. Danny was still asleep, oblivious to the storm raging around him. Tyler dropped a folder onto the table. "I found something, and you're not going to like it." Nate flipped it open. Inside were pages of financial records, wire transfers, and legal documents. His eyes skimmed through the contents, his stomach tightening with each line he read. Rebecca leaned over. "What am I looking at?" Tyler tapped the folder. "Bribes. Donovan's been paying off officials, making backdoor deals to ensure he gets what he wants. And not just in business, he's been greasing the wheels in family court, too." Nate exhaled slowly, his hands tightening around the paper. "So he's trying to buy his way into Danny's life." "Exactly," Tyler confirmed. "A judge, a couple of court clerks, they're all on his payroll. If this goes unchecked, he could win custody, no matter what's in Danny's best interest." Rebecca let out a string of curses under her breath. We need to expose him, publicly. We need to blow this up before the decision comes down. Nate shook his head. Not yet. Rebecca blinked. What do you mean, not yet? We have him. Nate's mind was already working. If he went public too soon, Donovan would deny everything, spin it in his favor, and claim it was a smear campaign. But if they waited, if they struck at the right moment, Donovan wouldn't be able to recover. We wait until the day of the ruling, Nate decided. We make sure the judge sees this before the decision is final, and we make sure Donovan doesn't have time to cover his tracks. Rebecca studied him, then nodded. All right, but we need to be ready. The second we get a chance, we hit him with everything we've got. Nate turned to Tyler. Make sure this gets in front of the right people, media, law enforcement, the judge herself. But not before I give the go-ahead. Tyler smirked. You got it. That evening, Nate found Danny sitting on the balcony, watching the city lights. He joined him, taking a seat on the lounge chair beside him. You're quiet tonight, Nate observed. Danny shrugged. Just thinking. Nate waited. Danny had a way of processing things internally before speaking, and Nate had learned to give him space when he needed it. Finally, the boy spoke. What if the judge says I have to go? Nate's chest tightened. He didn't want to lie to Danny, didn't want to promise something he couldn't guarantee. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen, Nate said. I promise you that. Danny nodded, but he still looked uncertain. What if he says he loves me? Nate exhaled. Love isn't just words, Danny. It's actions. And Donovan's actions don't show love. They show control. Danny was quiet for a long moment before he whispered, I don't want to go with him. Nate placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You won't. Danny looked up at him then, his small face filled with more trust than Nate felt he deserved. But he wasn't going to let that trust be misplaced. He was going to win this, no matter what it took. The day of the ruling arrived faster than Nate expected. The courtroom was packed, tension hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Nate sat at the defense table, Martin Hale at his side. Across from them, Donovan looked as smug as ever, his lawyer whispering in his ear. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. She looked between the two parties, her expression unreadable. I have reviewed both petitions carefully, she began, and this has been one of the most challenging cases I've presided over. Both parties have the resources to provide for Daniel Brooks. Both have argued their case well. Nate's hands curled into fists beneath the table. But, the judge continued, one factor weighs heavier than all others, the best interest of the child. She adjusted her glasses and turned to Donovan. Mr. Donovan, while I acknowledge your claims of wanting to be involved in your son's life, there is considerable evidence that calls into question your motivations. She picked up the file Tyler had provided and held it up. New evidence has come to light regarding questionable financial dealings, bribes, manipulation, efforts to influence this very court. Donovan's face paled. The judge's gaze hardened. This court does not take kindly to corruption, Mr. Donovan. And because of these findings, I am denying your petition for custody. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Donovan shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is absurd. These are baseless allegations. The judge slammed her gavel down. Sit down, Mr. Donovan. Seething, Donovan dropped back into his chair, his jaw clenched tight. The judge turned to Nate. Mr. Whitmore, your petition for legal guardianship is granted. Effective immediately, you are Daniel Brooks's legal guardian. For the first time in weeks, Nate felt the tight grip in his chest loosen. He had won. More importantly, Danny had won. The gavel slammed again. Court is adjourned. As soon as the ruling was official, Rebecca let out a breath beside him. Holy hell, you actually did it. Nate allowed himself a small smirk. Damn right I did. Donovan stormed out of the courtroom, his expression murderous, but Nate didn't care. His threats didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the boy waiting for him at home. When Nate stepped into the penthouse that evening, Danny was sitting on the couch, gripping the armrest anxiously. The moment their eyes met, Nate nodded. You're staying here. For good. Danny's eyes widened. Really? Really. A second later, Danny launched himself at Nate, wrapping his arms around him in a tight hug. For the first time, Nate let himself relax. He wrapped his arms around Danny, holding him close. You're home now, kid, Nate murmured, and you're not going anywhere. Nathaniel Whitmore had spent years focused on building an empire, making power moves, and ensuring that no one could ever take what he had built from him. But now, as he watched Danny eat his breakfast with a newfound lightness, he realized that power wasn't about wealth or control. It was about protecting the people who mattered. And for the first time in his life, he truly understood what that meant. The adoption process moved faster than expected. With Donovan's influence crippled and his credibility destroyed, the courts had no reason to delay. Within weeks, the paperwork was finalized. Danny Brooks was now officially Daniel Brooks Whitmore. The name looked right on paper. It felt right when Nate said it aloud. You got a new name now, Nate said as they left the courthouse, the papers freshly signed. Danny grinned up at him. Does that mean I have to wear suits now? Nate chuckled. Not unless you want to. Danny thought about that for a moment before shaking his head. Nah, but I do want to do something. What's that? Danny hesitated. Can we go visit Mom? Nate's breath caught for a moment before he nodded. Yeah, kid, we can do that. The cemetery was quiet, the autumn wind rustling through the trees. Danny stood in front of Claire's headstone, clutching a small bouquet of flowers he had picked out himself. For a long time he didn't speak. Neither did Nate. He knew this wasn't his moment. It was Danny's. Finally, the boy knelt and placed the flowers down gently. Hey, Mom, he said softly. I just wanted to tell you that I'm okay. And I hope you're okay too. His fingers traced the letters of her name. I met Nate. He's my dad now. He takes care of me. And he talks about you sometimes. Danny looked up at Nate then, his eyes filled with something deep and knowing. I think you loved her a lot. Nate swallowed. Yeah, I did. Danny nodded, satisfied. He turned back to the grave. I love you, Mom. I hope you're proud of me. Nate felt something shift in the air, as if Claire herself was watching over them. He rested a hand on Danny's shoulder, grounding them both in the moment. When Danny finally stood, his posture seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from him. Ready to go? Nate asked gently. Danny nodded. Yeah. As they walked back to the car, Danny slipped his small hand into Nate's. And just like that, they moved forward, together. Life at the penthouse felt different now, less like a fortress, more like a home. Danny settled into school, made friends, and for the first time, had a place to belong. He still had moments of uncertainty, moments where he hesitated as if waiting for something to be taken away from him. But they were fewer now, less heavy. And Nate? He was learning that fatherhood wasn't about perfection. It was about being there, about showing up every day no matter what. Rebecca, of course, took every opportunity to remind him of that. You know, she said one afternoon, watching as Nate tried and failed to help Danny with his math homework. I never thought I'd see the day when Nathaniel Whitmore voluntarily spent his evenings solving fractions. Nate shot her a dry look. I run a multi-billion-dollar corporation. This shouldn't be this hard. Rebecca smirked. Welcome to parenting. Danny grinned. She's right, you know. Nate sighed, closing the textbook. Fine. Maybe we hire a tutor. Rebecca laughed. Look at you, Whitmore, admitting you need help. Nate shook his head, but there was amusement in his expression. He had changed, he knew that. And surprisingly, he was okay with it. One evening, after Danny had gone to bed, Nate found himself standing on the balcony, watching the city below. Rebecca joined him, a glass of wine in her hand. You're different, she said simply. Nate glanced at her. Yeah? She nodded. You used to be all business, all strategy. Now? You actually care about something beyond your empire. Nate exhaled. Maybe I just realized that power isn't the most important thing. Rebecca tilted her head. And what is? Nate looked back inside, where Danny's drawings were taped to the fridge, where a half-finished puzzle sat on the coffee table, where a home had slowly started to form around him. Family, he said simply. Rebecca smiled. Took you long enough. Nate smirked. You gonna say, I told you so? She grinned. Nah, I'll save that for later. Silence settled between them, comfortable and familiar. And for the first time in a long time, Nathaniel Whitmore wasn't thinking about the next deal, the next fight, the next conquest. He was just here, and for once, that was enough. 1 year later, Nathaniel Whitmore stood at the edge of Greenwood Cemetery, his hands in his pockets as he watched Danny place a small bouquet of lilies in front of Claire's headstone. The boy had grown in the past year, not just in height, but in confidence. He no longer hunched his shoulders like he was trying to disappear, no longer hesitated before speaking. Danny belonged. And for the first time in his life, so did Nate. Danny knelt in front of the grave and whispered something under his breath. Then, after a moment, he stood and looked up at Nate with a small smile. I told her I'm happy. Nate's throat tightened, but he managed a nod. She'd want that. Danny reached for his hand, and Nate took it without hesitation. They turned away from the grave together, walking back toward the car where Rebecca was waiting, leaning against the sleek black sedan with her arms crossed. You two done with the sentimental stuff? She teased. Danny grinned. We can't all be heartless like you. Rebecca gasped in mock offense. Excuse me? I'll have you know I have a heart. I just don't waste it on unnecessary emotions. Nate smirked, reaching for the passenger side door. That's why you cried at Danny's adoption hearing? Rebecca shot him a glare. I had something in my eye. Danny laughed as he climbed into the back seat. Sure you did. Nate slid into the driver's seat, glancing at Rebecca as she buckled in. Where to? Rebecca shrugged. Home. Home. The word settled over Nate like a promise. For so long his penthouse had been nothing more than walls and expensive furniture, a fortress built to keep the world at a distance. But now when he walked through that door, he wasn't alone. He had a son, he had laughter and warmth and maybe something more. As he pulled out of the cemetery, Rebecca glanced over at him, a knowing smile on her lips. You ready for tonight? Nate groaned. The school fundraiser? Danny's school fundraiser, Rebecca corrected, which you promised to attend, and where you are expected to bid generously. Nate sighed. How much is this going to cost me? Rebecca smirked. Oh, it's not about the money. It's about making an impression. Parents talk, and you want to show them you're not just the terrifying billionaire dad. Danny piped up from the back seat. You kinda are. Nate rolled his eyes. You two are enjoying this too much. Rebecca reached over and squeezed his hand briefly before letting go. That's because we like seeing you squirm, Whitmore. Nate shook his head, but he was smiling as he drove. For years he had believed that wealth and power were the only things that mattered. that emotions were liabilities, that attachments only led to loss. But now, as he glanced in the rearview mirror at his son and felt Rebecca's presence beside him, he knew the truth. This was real power, not money, not business deals, family, love. And he wasn't letting go of it for anything. As the city skyline rose in the distance, Nate drove toward a future he never could have imagined. A future he had chosen. A future built on love.